I was actually sort of excited that Datadog threw up the CAMS theory of DevOps. Who here is familiar with that? Culture, automation, measurement, sharing. Hopefully, like, every hand went up because, like, they just mentioned it 5 minutes ago. I know, cheaters. I'm really partial to measurement because measurement gives us 3 of those and 4 if we're not doing it by hand, which we should not be doing it by hand, hopefully ever, because metrics really does shape our culture. Metrics gives us something to talk about, so that's the culture piece. Hopefully we're doing it automatically. It's the measurement piece, and it helps us share. So it's something that I mentioned here, right? So we don't really think about metrics this way, but measurement really is culture. It gives us something to talk about. It gives us something to measure. It helps us communicate across those silos, across those boundaries, and this is really what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'll start by telling a story that some of us may be familiar with. If you've ever been to one of my talks, it's probably one of my favorites, although Amazon probably isn't like one of the best places to work in at least, you know, some of their areas. But this really is a fascinating story, and it's really, really telling. So who here is familiar with the shopping cart and the recommender system that Amazon has? Just about everyone, right? Do we know the origins, though? So the origin story for this is really, really fascinating. If we think about the corollary to the grocery store, we go to the grocery store, we go to a convenience store, we're on our way out, and there's like gum, there's candies, there's magazines. They basically have us physically trapped. So they have things that we can get on the way out because there's high likelihood that we're going to grab something on our way out. There's low likelihood that we're just going to change our mind and leave. So Greg Linden mocked up a prototype and said, I've got this great idea. I think we should do ideas on the way out that you could shop for, but because we're Amazon, we have data. We can recommend specific things for someone that they can buy on their way out to check out. He walks down to his senior vice president's office and says, I think we should implement this. So SVP says, cool idea. No. Super no. Absolutely not. Why? Because this is the internet. Someone can get distracted and just leave, right? This is not like a physical grocery store or a convenience store where I'm going to have a shopping cart and like drop it and walk out the door, right? We can get distracted, we can leave. He says no. Greg Linden puts his head down. I imagine this, right? I'm kind of elaborating a little bit. Puts his head down, walks back to his office, codes up an A/B test, pushes into production. NBD, right? It'll be fine. I'm sure it'll be fine. Leaves it in production for a few weeks. Goes back and has data showing that it increases revenue by a few percentage points. Who here works in an environment where, against the express wishes of the SVP, they dare do this and then won't get fired? Both hands. But Greg Linden wrote this up and he says this: as good as Amazon was, it did not yet have a culture that fully embraced measurement and debate. I think building this culture is the key to innovation. Creativity must flow from everywhere. Whether you're a summer intern or the CTO, any good idea must be able to seek an objective test, preferably a test that exposes the idea to real customers. Everyone must be able to experiment, learn, and iterate. So he knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew that the culture would prioritize data over opinions, an opinion of anyone. For innovation to flourish, measurement must rule. And we know how this story ended. We now have recommendations of the shopping carts. And the SVP wasn't particularly happy, by the way, but also ceded that this was a good idea. Push. Okay, so measurement is culture. There is absolutely an aspect of culture that can be based on measurement and data. So let's keep this in mind as we go through this. So this talk is full of cliches, by the way. You can't improve what you don't measure. Or at the very least, you will have no idea that you've actually improved anything. We will never know. And that really is the basis of the continuous improvement paradigm. We want to make small improvements over and over and over and over again. And we want to be able to see those add up, because small improvements are the key to large gains. The interesting thing is that in business, we want to think that everything that we do is improvement. We love this idea, particularly in computing and in software engineering. Unfortunately, the old heuristic, the rule of thumb is that only about 50% of the things that we build actually work. Until you go to like the people in suits, they think that everything that we build is awesome, right? If we go to the people in suits, they're like, well, everything I do is awesome. All of my ideas are great. Everything that I build is great. Ronnie Kohavi was at Google for years, and he said that their benchmark was about 50% of what they built was going to work. Then he went to Microsoft, and he told Microsoft, your hit rate is going to be about 50%. Microsoft didn't believe him. They said, no, we know our customer base. We've been building the Microsoft things for years. We know that we're better than 50%. He finally convinced them to build out a platform to test their success rate in building out all of their features. What he found at Microsoft, that evaluating well-designed and executed experiments to improve a key metric, only about 1/3 were successful at improving the key metric. So again, measure, see what it is that you're improving. So the other interesting thing here, 1/3 improved the key metric, 1/3 were a net null, 1/3 decreased. So if we implement absolutely everything, we're kind of at like a null. We're going nowhere. We're running really fast to get nowhere. Another thing to think about, so even if we pull out those 1/3 that get us nothing, if we keep those 1/3 that get us a net null, just in case, all that does is contribute to our technical debt. We have to monitor and keep track of all of that extra work just for funsies. No. A whole lot of no. Okay. Another thing. Always measure things that matter. Who here has read The Goal? Or heard of The Goal? Oh, you guys, this is such a great book. So I used to be a professor, and I would make my students read this book. By the way, in an accounting class. And they hated me. They're like, this is a novel. And then they would read it. And they're like, this is great. Why didn't you make us read it at the beginning of the semester? Because I just had it due at the end because I was lazy. I didn't want to like grade all these papers at the beginning. Totally read it. By the way, this is, who's read the Phoenix Project? Who's at least heard of the Phoenix Project? Okay, so the Phoenix Project is modeled after The Goal. So there are a lot of similarities here. The basis behind this story is a gentleman who takes over a manufacturing plant, and he's told that he has to turn around and improve productivity, or the plant is going to be shut down. And he's stressing, and he walks in and he says, well, what do we have to do? And they say, we have to increase productivity, and we have to decrease waste. And he runs into his old philosophy or physics professor, Jonah, in an airport. And Jonah's all like Mr. Socratic method, which is super frustrating. And he says, well, what's the goal? And he keeps asking him all these questions, and he finally points out, the goal is not to increase productivity. The goal is not to decrease waste. The goal is to make money. That is the goal. I mean, sorry, this is business, right? I see this several times when I work with companies when they're working with metrics as well. I was working with another company, and they kept saying, this is our goal, this is our goal. So, we were working with helping them optimize their software development and delivery. I've run the state of DevOps report for the last several years, so I've got over 25,000 data points. And I was helping them think about this, and they kept saying, well, we want to do continuous delivery, we want to get continuous delivery, we want to get continuous delivery. And I'm like, why? No. You want to optimize your IT performance. We want to be delivering software faster and reliably because then we make money, right? Because if we can deliver our software fast and reliably, we make an impact in the market. Don't do the continuous delivery, don't do the DevOps because DevOps. Measure things that matter. Don't measure things in silos, because then you'll just cycle and circle around on that. Related to that, that which is measured gets managed. Has anyone seen that happen? If you throw a number in front of a manager, they're gonna love that. Related, in business, you are what you measure. And I've seen really interesting examples of this. An example here was I saw a firm measure the number of times that an employee was absent. I mean, it wasn't even something that a manager was rated on, but it was just the number of times that an employee was absent. It wasn't the length of the absence, but it was just the number of times an employee was absent. By the way, this company had unlimited PTO. But suddenly the manager cared more about how many times the employee was absent, so they preferred that they were gone the entire week instead of out Monday and Friday and back Tuesday through Thursday when they had unlimited PTO. So just pay attention to those kinds of things, because the things that are measured get managed. It turns into KPIs and local optimizations. Now, if you capture only one metric, you know exactly what's going to get gamed. Have you guys ever seen this? You know all about gaming the system? The most common examples here are usually around tickets and ticketing systems. And the best example of this is thinking about what the end goal in mind is, again, right? So if we only focus in on the near-term goals, so if we think about closing tickets on time, keeping up with SLAs, gaming metrics is so prevalent when you don't keep in mind the context and the goal. So closing tickets on time, you win, right? So responding to a ticket on time, or keeping the number of tickets to a minimum, or closing tickets within a certain window. These types of metrics get gamed all the time, and they get gamed because they're easy to measure, they're easy to automate. I see these things happen all the time, right? I'm sure, have we seen this? I'm seeing a few heads nod, and I'm seeing some smiles, right? Because we can set up a system that will auto-reply to a ticket. We can set up a system that will close a ticket on a Friday and that will reopen it on a Monday. I have seen systems that will reply to a ticket and close it automatically, because so many times customers won't notice, and they might not care. The problem is that the customers are still unhappy at the end, and the goal hopefully is to increase whoever our end users are, right? Or we might be supporting internal users. That's the goal, right? The goal is wherever our outcome is should be maintaining end users or keeping our customers happy. If we're ignoring that, all those other internal metrics or one or two metrics that are super easy to game, I've seen companies introduce those metrics, and suddenly with over the quarter, they're like, all of our metrics we drastically improved by 350%. Yeah, you did. All of your customers are super pissed. Not good. If you capture only one or two metrics that are, especially if they're easy to automate, you know what's going to be gamed. Still didn't make your customer happy. Not everything that can be counted counts. Sometimes we just measure all the things, particularly in monitoring, because if we can just collect everything and throw it into a database, we're set. No, super no. Sometimes it's better to measure half of the things if we know that those half of the things are actually important. So, stop and ask yourself, what is this actually telling me? Can I use this to make a decision? How does this relate to an outcome, that goal I was talking about earlier? Does it still make sense to measure and track this metric, especially after a few quarters, maybe a couple years? Is this still meaningful? And what are the unintended consequences of measuring this? The second bullet is, the first and second bullets are particularly interesting. Through my work measuring and doing the state of DevOps report, we actually found that metrics that are used and measurements that are used to make business decisions, which I point out because in this crowd, we're all gonna hopefully feel this, particularly after the last talk, right? So not just like measures that are used to wake us up at 3 o'clock in the morning, no. But things that are used to make business decisions are predictive of IT and organizational performance. So they help us do our work better and they help make our companies money. So these types of metrics in particular are really, really meaningful and impactful. Okay, now this one. Metrics inform our incentives and they shape our behavior. It's interesting, sometimes I bring this up and people get all touchy. You know, like they don't want me to say the incentive word, but it's true, right? Once you put a number out there, it will eventually get managed and it will eventually get tied to incentives somehow. It will shape the culture. It will change the way we do our work. So, let's take a look at let's look at a traditional dev environment, right? The metric is to deliver code on schedule. The behavior is to sprint to deliver that code at 5 p.m. on Friday. The unintended consequence is that our ops team spends the weekend putting out fires. No. No. This one. Just because something is hard to measure doesn't mean it is worth measuring, or it isn't worth measuring. So this is the opposite to the one where it's like, we have all the things, we can just collect it all, throw it in a database. The opposite of this is that sometimes things are hard to measure. Figure out how to measure it. Okay, I'm going to turn around for this. Who here thinks that survey data is shit? Some hands, that's fine. Who here thinks that your log file is amazing and full of great data? Totally fine. I see some hands. Who here has seen shit data in your log files? All the hands. It's true, okay? It happens, right? We see really awful data in your log files. There are ways to get reasonable data out of surveys. I have also seen like lies, straight lies in surveys, because if you write your surveys badly, because you can, right? If I ask you a question like, did your boss lie to you last week? That's a bad survey question. So we can fix this. We can do this through psychometrics. There are known good ways how to do this. So the trick is that some of the data that we want to collect, we can get out of our log files. Sometimes the data that we want to collect is on something like culture. Because by the way, we want to measure the culture in our organizations directly, but you can't, right? Like I can't walk around and collect the temperature of my people, well, their actual temperature, but I can't collect like the culture temperature directly. So we need to do it through something like a survey, because people matter. I know, by the way, like I can tell you fascinating stories. We should go chat sometime. There have been studies. One of my good friends studied the scientists at NASA, and she studied the Mars rover team, the scientists that worked on Mars rover, and the scientists that worked on the Jupiter Cassini mission. Like, so these like robots leave, right? You can't reorg those teams, by the way, because like it's built into the systems. When the scientists start fighting, the robots start breaking. Not kidding. Our culture affects our technology. So culture is important to study. So this is fascinating. This is from Ron Westrom. He did a study, or he wrote up this typology in 2004. He did his work, he's a sociologist, and he did his work in healthcare and aviation. And this is particularly interesting because, and it's applicable to our work, technology, because it's highly adaptive complex systems that are high risk, and it is predictive of outcomes and performance, and it also helps explain what happens when things go wrong. Technology. This is totally us. It's great. We have found this to be predictive of IT performance and organizational performance for 3 years in a row, which is great. So we took a look at this. Who here has a friend that works in a pathological organization low cooperation, messengers are shot, bridging's discouraged, couple hands. Okay, so across the few years of State of DevOps surveys, we see about 15% showing up here. In the who here is a friend that works in a bureaucratic team? Modest cooperation, messengers neglected, I see some hands. We see about 55% here. Narrow responsibilities, bridging's tolerated. Okay, generative culture. Who here is a friend? High cooperation, messengers are trained, risks are shared. We see about a third show up here. Again, we see statistical differences among high, medium, and low performing teams. So significant differences that are statistically significant. Failure leads to inquiry. So I mentioned culture is important. We want to be able to measure this. You can measure this in a statistically valid and reliable way. You can ask your teams to rate how strongly they agree or disagree on the following statements. So on a scale from 1 to 7, so strongly agree to strongly disagree, these questions, these 6 questions, there are several teams that I know across the industry now that are running this survey on a quarterly basis. Some of them are just doing it twice a year if they don't feel like they have the time. It doesn't take very long. You can average these scores. So this is known as a latent construct, right? Because I can't just like take your temperature, but I can come up with these questions, I can combine them into a latent construct, and then I can combine them across teams. So this is psychometrics. It's difficult, but it's not impossible now. And this has been validated across several years. It's shown up in a few academic papers. My nerd happy moment was Ron Westrom actually emailed me. And he was like, I hear you're using my stuff, can I see it? And then he emailed me back and he was like, you're doing it right. I was like, yay! Didn't screw it up. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up really quick. Okay, so what can we do? If we wanna do this ourselves, hopefully I've convinced you that metrics influences our culture. Metrics is culture. You can read and share data-driven. It's a great short book from O'Reilly. It's free, it's about 20 pages. You could even share it through your own teams. You can ask others about metrics. Is it happening in your teams? Is it happening in other teams? Where is it happening? Who's using it? Is it important somewhere else? Think about your own metrics. What are you doing on your own teams? What would your outcomes be? Who are your own end users? Think about once you have your outcomes identified, what influences those? How do you think you can drive those outcomes? And then, I loved the previous talk, I was so excited. Define it clearly, because this is how you're going to communicate it across, and then communicate it. So have a clear definition and then communicate it. So again, the key here, if possible, give it a meaningful name. The key here, give meaningful names, define them well, communicate them often and across boundaries, because metrics are culture. So today we've talked about how measurement's culture. You can't improve what you don't measure. You should always measure things that matter. That which is measured gets managed. So if you can take a role in this, please do. You can help define what is managed. If you capture only one metric, you know what's going to get gamed. Metrics inform our incentives, which then shape behavior. Not everything that can be counted counts. And just because something is hard to measure doesn't mean it's not worth measuring. So ask yourself, if measurement is culture and you aren't measuring your work, how is that affecting your culture? Thank you. Sure. Maybe 1 or 2 quick questions, but I know it is break time. I see one hand in the back.
So if you start measuring those survey responses, then won't that also become incentivized in game?
So the question is, if you start measuring those survey responses, won't that also start incentivizing things? So not necessarily. It depends on how you're using them. So if you're using them and if you're communicating that it's a way to better understand the culture and what's happening, then that can be kind of safe. If you are making it pretty clear that the goal is to improve the culture in and of itself, then that can be a problem. But yeah, once you start measuring it, then you've changed the you've changed the playing field. But you're also then communicating that the culture is important, which can be a good thing. Okay, break time. Thanks, everyone.